A veteran Navy SEAL thought the war was behind him, until his dog pulled him off the trail and into the bright northern woods. Under moss and silence, they found a buried police G-Wagon and a K9 collar with the name scratched away. Then the radio crackled to life with one broken warning: don't trust the badge. Someone had hidden this for 12 years, and someone is still watching from the trees. A map marked with an X leads them to a lockbox that shatters a deputy's past and proves a cover-up. And when a professional trap snaps on the dog, the SEAL must choose revenge or the right way. Where are you watching from today? Like and subscribe to K9 Navy SEAL Stories. Mason Rourke lived where the map turned green and quiet. Up in the northern band of America, where pine trees stood like spears left behind by old gods, and lakes shone like polished shields. The town itself was small enough to hold in one palm, the kind of place with a single diner, a 2-pump gas station, and a post office that smelled faintly of paper and winter. He had come here to listen to sunlight, as he sometimes joked to himself. Because if he didn't joke, the memories would do the talking. At 43, Mason carried his past the way some men carried weather, always around him, invisible until it wasn't. He was tall, about 6'1", with broad shoulders that made door frames feel narrow. His body was still built like a tool meant for hard jobs. Dense, disciplined muscle from years of training that didn't really leave you, even when you wanted it to. His face was cut sharp, angles and edges, strong jawline, cheekbones that caught the morning light like stone. A faint, scruffy beard shadowed his jaw, not a full statement, just the honest evidence of a man who forgot, or refused, to fuss. His eyes were the color of storm water, blue-gray, deep-set, and always measuring. They looked calm most of the time, but calm can be a mask. His skin stayed sun-browned, even in colder months, as if the sun had stamped him and never took its signature back. His hair was short and practical, dark brown clipped in a military cut, with early silver at the temples that made him look older when the light hit it right. Older and more tired. He wore the same outfit, almost like a uniform he'd chosen for this new life. An olive field jacket, dark blue cargo pants, and underneath, a red and deep blue plaid shirt that felt like a stubborn bit of warmth against the world. His brown leather boots were scuffed and softened with miles. An old military watch hugged his wrist, its face scratched, its hands stubborn. A pocket knife rode his thigh like habit on. His back, an Eberle stock half-track pack sat snug and ready, as if he might be called to move at any second. He told himself the pack was for hikes and emergencies. He knew it was also for fear. Beside him, moving with the quiet confidence of a creature born to patrol the edge of danger, walked Coda. Coda was a retired German Shepherd K9, black and tan, short-haired, thick-coated, built like a spring that had learned patience. His frame was balanced and athletic, muscled tight and clean under his coat. He didn't prance the way pet dogs did. He didn't wander. His paws placed themselves with intention, and his stance, when he stopped, was solid, ready, like a sentinel carved out of living wood. His eyes were what people noticed first. They were dark, intelligent, focused. Eyes that didn't simply look at the world, but read it. Coda's ears were always half-tuned to the wind, to distant snaps of branches, to the tiny shift in Mason's breathing when a memory brushed too close. Loyalty lived in him the way blood lived in Mason, constant and unquestioned. But Coda's loyalty wasn't blind. His instincts were strong, sharp as flint. When he sensed something familiar and wrong, danger that smelled like yesterday's disaster, he would stop. Not out of disobedience, out of warning. That morning, the sky was clear and bright, the kind of bright that seemed almost rude. Sunlight spilled over the tree line and turned the frost in shaded patches into glitter. Mason took the trail like he always did. Steady pace, eyes scanning out of habit, shoulders loosened only because he forced them to be. This was supposed to be simple. A walk, a breath, an offering to the day. Coda trotted at Mason's left, leash slack, harness snug against his chest. No drama, no trouble. Just the quiet ritual of two survivors pretending they were ordinary. Then Coda slowed. Not the casual slow of curiosity, the sudden, precise slow of a switch flipping. His head lifted. His nose tasted the air. His body stiffened, not with fear but with attention, like a radio locking onto a frequency. Mason felt it too, though he didn't have Coda's nose. He felt it as a prickling at the base of his neck, a tightening in his ribs. The world didn't change, but something inside him did. Coda turned off the trail. Mason stopped. Coda. The dog didn't pull hard. He didn't lunge. He simply leaned into the new direction as if it were the only direction left. Mason tightened his grip on the leash. No. Coda looked back, eyes steady. Not pleading, not defiant, just certain. That certainty hit Mason like a cold wave, because once, years ago, there had been another certainty. Another moment when he'd believed a sign, believed a person, believed the clean authority of a badge and the confident tone behind it. That belief had led his team into an ambush that did not feel like war so much as betrayal. A friend had gone down. Blood and sand and shouting. A K9 had been hurt badly. A dog that had done nothing wrong except trust the wrong humans. Mason had carried that scene in him ever since. Some men carried photographs in their wallets. Mason carried the sound of a dog yelping once, just once, before training forced silence, before pain became mission. He swallowed hard, jaw tightening. Coda held his gaze as if saying, "This isn't then." But it rhymes. Mason exhaled through his nose, a slow, controlled breath like he'd been trained to do underwater, under fire, under the weight of his own pulse. "Fine," he muttered, more to himself than to Coda. 1 minute. Coda stepped forward immediately, as if the forest had been holding its breath and could finally exhale. They left the trail and entered the trees. The woods were bright, but brightness can be a trick. Sunlight filtered through branches and shattered beams. The scent of pine resin and damp earth layered itself like old stories. Birds chattered in the canopy like gossiping spirits. Somewhere far off, water moved. Slow, patient, eternal. Mason followed, boots crunching lightly on needles and frozen leaves. His eyes tracked the ground, the slope, the breaks in branches. He wasn't hunting anything. He told himself that. But his body remembered how to hunt, and it didn't ask permission. Coda moved with increasing focus, nose low, then high, then low again, sampling scent like a librarian flipping through invisible pages. Every few steps he paused, ears swiveling. His tail was level, controlled. Mason tried to laugh, a dry little sound. "You're acting like you found buried treasure." Coda's ears flicked, unimpressed by humor. Mason's own humor was like that, rare and blunt, the kind you dropped like a rock into a silent room just to hear something other than your thoughts. They pushed deeper. The air cooled slightly, shaded by denser pines. The ground dipped. Mason's pulse kept time with old instincts, and he hated it, because the day was too beautiful for panic. He thought of the badge again, thought of the way authority could be worn like a costume, thought of how easy it was for humans to lie and how difficult it was for dogs to do anything but tell the truth with their bodies. Coda suddenly stopped. Mason nearly bumped into him. The dog's posture changed, Weight forward, shoulders stiff, head angled toward a patch of undergrowth. Coda didn't growl. He didn't bark. He simply froze. Mason's hand moved without thought to the pocket knife clipped inside his cargo pocket. He didn't pull it. Yet. The motion was a reflex, like touching a scar to make sure it was still there. Then Coda took 3 slow steps and stopped again. That's when Mason saw it. An unnatural line beneath the moss. A shape that didn't belong to roots or rocks. A sliver of something hard, man-made, partially buried under green. At first it looked like a broken piece of metal. Then the sun hit it, and color flashed. Red, blue. A police light, bar. Mason's stomach tightened. He stared as if the forest had just spoken his name. He stepped closer, boots careful, scanning for wires, traps, anything. His mind painted possibilities too quickly. Dump site, stolen vehicle, forgotten evidence, someone's secret. Coda moved ahead of him and, strangely, positioned his body between Mason and the half-buried object. Protective. Not of Mason from the object. Of the object from Mason. Mason's brows knit. What is this, buddy? Coda's eyes stayed locked on the mossy shape, and for the first time Mason noticed something else. Something that made the hair on his arms lift. The object didn't smell old. Not entirely. Mason couldn't smell what Coda could, but he could see Coda's nostrils flare, the way the dog's breathing shifted into that sharp pattern that meant recent. Someone had been here. Maybe not today. But not decades ago either. Mason crouched and brushed moss aside with gloved fingers. More metal emerged. Corner of a hood. A ridge of a fender. The outline became undeniable. A vehicle. Large, boxy, buried like a shame. Mason's throat went dry. He reached for his phone automatically, then remembered the dead signal he'd had back on the trail. He checked anyway. 1 bar flickered, insultingly weak. He stood and slowly pivoted, scanning the trees. The woods remained calm, cheerful even, sunlit and indifferent. But the calm didn't comfort him. It felt like the hush before a trap. Coda's ears angled toward the vehicle again, and he took 1 step, then stopped. The dog's muscles trembled, not with fear, but with restraint. Mason moved closer, careful, and found what looked like the rear door seam under the moss. His hand hovered over it. A part of him whispered, "Don't." Another part, the part that had always run toward fire, said, "Find out." He pressed his palm to the metal, cold, damp, real. He tried the handle. It didn't budge. He adjusted his grip, pulled again, still, stuck. Coda shifted, stepping in front of the door more firmly. His gaze flicked to Mason's face, then back to the seam. It was a warning, clear as spoken language. Slow. Mason swallowed. His heart thumped once, heavy. Then, right as he leaned in to look closer, a sharp, dry sound echoed from inside the buried vehicle. Click. Not a branch snapping, not ice breaking. A mechanical click, like a lock turning, like a latch being tested. Like someone inside had just touched something they shouldn't, or someone outside had just triggered a mechanism. Mason froze so completely the world seemed to pause with him. Coda stood rigid, blocking the door, his body a living barrier. In the bright, innocent morning, the forest suddenly felt ancient, like it had been waiting for them, like it had lured them with sunlight the way old myths lured heroes with singing streams. Mason's voice came out low, controlled, almost reverent. "Okay," he whispered. He didn't know if he was talking to Coda, or the woods, or whatever had just clicked in the dark. He tightened his grip on the leash, and the two of them, man and dog, stared at the moss-covered police vehicle as if it were an altar, or a warning, or the mouth of a story that had just opened. And somewhere inside Mason, the old wound stirred. Not to break him this time, but to remind him. Sometimes the path that saves a soul is the same path that scares it. Mason didn't touch the door again. He kept his hand on Coda's leash and let the quiet settle. Let the bright woods pretend to be innocent while his body did the old math. Distance, cover, wind direction, how fast a man could disappear if he had to. Coda stayed planted in front of the half-buried vehicle like a carved guardian, shoulders square, ears angled forward. His black and tan coat looked almost glossy where the sun found it. But his eyes were pure work. Dark, focused, and unblinking. He wasn't barking. He wasn't panicking. He was doing something far more unsettling. He was choosing silence. Mason eased back a step, boots compressing wet needles. His olive field jacket brushed a pine branch, and a few drops of melted frost slid down his sleeve like cold beads. He glanced around the trees again, slow and careful, the way a man looks when he doesn't want the forest to know he's afraid. He pulled his phone out, thumb hovering over the screen. No signal. Of course, he'd moved deep enough that the town's fragile bars of connectivity didn't dare follow. The northern woods had always been like this. Beautiful, wide, and stubborn. A place where the modern world gave up quickly. Mason exhaled, jaw tight. "All right," he murmured, not quite to Coda, not quite to himself. "We do this the right way." Coda's ears flicked. He didn't move. He didn't need permission to understand that tone. Mason stepped away from the vehicle and started scanning for higher ground. His boots found a gentle slope, a hump of glacial rock that rose above the underbrush. As he climbed, he felt the familiar pull of hyper-awareness, his mind trying to turn every bird call into a threat, every shadow into a figure. He hated that part of himself. He needed it anyway. At the top, the world opened into a bright quilt of treetops. Mason lifted the phone again. 1 bar. Then 2. Like a reluctant handshake. He placed the call before the signal could change its mind. When the dispatcher answered, Mason's voice shifted into that crisp, controlled cadence that used to calm men in worse places than this. He gave coordinates. He didn't dramatize. He didn't embellish. He simply offered the truth, like a clean blade. "Possible abandoned police vehicle," he said. "Partially buried. Looks like it's been here a long time. Requesting local response and a ranger." He didn't mention Coda's behavior. Not yet. That part would sound like superstition to people who had never watched a working dog read the world like scripture. He ended the call and climbed back down. Coda was still there, still silent, still watching. Mason crouched a few yards away and began documenting the scene properly. Wide shots, close-ups, the surrounding area. He snapped photos of the terrain and took a careful GPS pin while the signal still fluttered in and out. He didn't disturb anything else. He knew what evidence meant. He also knew what it meant to lose it. As he worked, he noticed the smallest signs. Details a civilian might never register. A strip of nylon snagged on a thorn bush near the vehicle. A smear of something dark on a tree trunk that wasn't sap. And a faint scent on the air that didn't belong to pine or earth. Coda's nose lifted and tested it again. His body stiffened. That was when Mason saw it clearly. This wasn't just old abandonment. This place had been visited. He waited with Coda, keeping his distance from the vehicle, letting the woods do what woods did. Whisper, glitter, pretend. A squirrel chattered angrily somewhere. A gust of wind sent a soft shiver through the pines. Then, after what felt like both minutes and hours, the sound of an engine threaded through the trees. Not loud, not aggressive, controlled. A vehicle stopped at the edge of the trail, and 2 figures appeared between the trunks. The first was a woman in her early 30s, built lean and capable, moving with the brisk certainty of someone who'd learned to be decisive in a small town where backup sometimes arrived late. Her uniform was neat but lived in, and her duty belt sat on her hips like a familiar weight. She had chestnut brown hair pulled back into a practical ponytail, a few loose strands catching sunlight across her cheek. Her skin was fair with a dusting of freckles across her nose, as if the northern summers had tried to mark her with gentleness. Her eyes, hazel and sharp, took in Mason, Coda, and the scene in one sweep. Deputy Lila Hart. Her face carried the kind of composure that didn't come from being unafraid. It came from knowing fear and refusing to let it drive. A thin scar ran near her left eyebrow, the faintest signature of a past moment that had demanded payment. She didn't look like someone who liked surprises, and yet her job was built on them. Beside her came a man older by at least a decade, tall and wiry, wearing ranger green outerwear that blended into the forest like camouflage designed by nature. His beard was salt and pepper and cut short, his jaw strong and weathered, his nose slightly crooked as if the woods had once hit him hard and he'd accepted the lesson. His eyes were pale, almost washed blue, and they carried the patient fatigue of someone who had spent too many years looking for lost hikers, cleaning up after careless hunters, and explaining to tourists that the wilderness didn't care about their plans. Ranger Silas Keene. He moved like someone who listened more than he spoke, feet careful, hands relaxed, but ready. His posture said he'd seen enough to know that the forest could turn fast, even on a bright day. Lila's gaze flicked to Mason's old military watch, the scuffed boots, the half-track pack. "Mason Rourke?" she asked. Mason nodded once. Her eyes shifted to Coda, then back to Mason. "Dispatch said you requested a ranger." Silas gave a small grunt that might have been greeting or might have been skepticism. "What have we got?" Mason kept his voice steady. "Vehicle partially buried. Marked police. Didn't touch anything beyond photographs. There are signs someone's been back here." That last line made Lila's mouth tighten. She stepped forward carefully, her attention sharpening like a blade being drawn. Coda shifted one step closer to Mason, subtle, protective. He didn't bare teeth. He simply aligned himself so that if something happened, he could respond first. Lila noticed. Her eyes softened for half a heartbeat, then hardened again. Professional first. "All right," she said. "We do this clean." She pulled out gloves and evidence tape, then moved with deliberate caution around the vehicle, taking in the moss, the ruts, the broken branches. Silas walked the perimeter, scanning for footprints, disturbed ground, unnatural lines in the brush. When Lila got close enough to see the markings and the shape of the vehicle beneath the growth, she let out a slow breath. Not surprise, something heavier, like recognition of a story she'd heard before, but never believed would become real. "We'll need to secure the area," she said. "Silas, can we set a temporary boundary?" Silas nodded. "Yeah, but first..." He crouched near the ground, eyes narrowing. His fingers hovered above the soil without touching it. "These tracks..." Mason watched him read the dirt like a page. Silas's expression darkened. "These aren't just old." Lila straightened slightly. "How new?" Silas leaned back onto his heels, jaw working. "Not today, but not 12 years ago either. Somebody's been out here recently." Coda's ears snapped forward at the word somebody. His eyes locked into the trees behind Silas, as if the forest itself had whispered a name. Mason felt a cold thread slide up his spine. Lila's gaze flicked to Mason. "You said it looked like it's been here a long time." "It does," Mason replied. "But the scene doesn't feel untouched." Silas gave a humorless huff. "Nothing stays untouched out here. The woods cover things. People uncover them." Lila began photographing and logging, methodical, She marked the approximate position and called in the need for a tow capable of handling rough terrain. Her voice was calm, but her shoulders had that faint tension of someone bracing for trouble. Silas continued his sweep and found the strip of nylon snagged on the thorn bush. He pointed it out without plucking it free. "That's not from the forest," he said. Lila nodded, eyes narrowing. "And that matters." Mason stayed close but out of the way, letting them do their work. He knew how law enforcement saw men like him, trained, capable, sometimes unpredictable. He wasn't here to perform heroics. He was here to make sure the truth didn't get trampled. Coda, however, had his own priorities. He moved with sudden purpose, still silent, toward a patch of brush a few yards from the vehicle. Mason watched his body language shift. Head low, nose working fast, tail steady. "Coda," Mason warned softly, not wanting him to disturb anything. The dog paused, then looked back at Mason with an intensity that felt almost human. And then Coda did something that made every hair on Mason's arms lift. He sat, not casually, not obediently. He sat like a working dog, signaling a find. Eyes locked on a specific point in the undergrowth, his body vibrating with restraint. Lila saw it immediately. Her posture changed. "That's a trained indication," she said, voice lower now. Mason swallowed. "He's retired," he said. "But he doesn't forget." Silas's gaze sharpened, and for the first time his ranger calm cracked just enough to reveal concern. "What's he indicating?" Coda didn't move. He only stared, steady as a lighthouse. Mason stepped carefully to Coda's side, then followed the line of his gaze. In the brush, partially hidden under wet leaves, was something small, dark, leather maybe, or thick fabric, caught in the roots of a fallen branch. Mason didn't touch it. He didn't need to, because even from a distance he saw the shape. A collar, heavy duty, the kind used for working dogs. Lila's breath caught just slightly. She crouched, gloved hands ready, and carefully cleared enough leaves to see it better without pulling it free. There were scratch marks across the nameplate. Deliberate. Someone had tried to erase an identity. Silas looked up at Mason, and his voice came out quieter than before. "That's not something the forest does." Mason stared at Coda, who remained still, eyes burning with focus. Coda didn't whine. He didn't tremble. He simply held his ground, as if the collar had called to him through time and pine needles and old wrongs. In that moment, the bright day felt like it dimmed, just a fraction, as if the forest had leaned closer to listen. Lila stood, collar documented, her expression now shaped by something beyond procedure. "We're impounding the vehicle," she said, "and we're treating this as an active investigation until proven otherwise." Silas nodded once. "I'll get the boundary set, and I'll talk to the tow operator, make sure they bring chains and a winch." Mason felt his pulse slow, not because he was less afraid, but because the chaos had become a plan. Plans were a kind of mercy. He looked down at Coda. "Good boy," he whispered, voice rough. "Whatever you're smelling, we'll do it right." Coda finally blinked once, a tiny release. But his ears stayed forward, and his body stayed ready, as if he knew the day had only just begun, even in all that sunlight. The tow truck arrived just before dusk. It wasn't the loud, reckless kind that chewed through mud without thinking. It was driven by a thick-shouldered man in his late 40s named Darren Pike, who stepped out with the heavy patience of someone who had spent his life hauling other people's mistakes out of ditches. Darren had a shaved head, a beard trimmed close along a jaw that looked carved from oak, and forearms roped with muscle from years of winch cables and frozen chains. He didn't talk much, but when he did, his words came measured and slow. He surveyed the half-buried G-Wagon with narrowed brown eyes. "She's been sleeping," he muttered. "Let's wake her careful." Under Ranger Silas Keene's direction, they rigged the chains and positioned the winch. Deputy Lila Hart documented everything. Her movements efficient, deliberate, her hazel eyes sharp beneath the lowering sun. She had removed her jacket and tied it around her waist, revealing a lean strength in her posture. The faint scar near her eyebrow caught the light again, subtle but stubborn. Mason stayed back, hands resting lightly on the straps of his half-track pack. Coda stood beside him, silent but alert, muscles tight beneath his coat. The G-Wagon came free inch by inch. Mud and moss tore loose in soft, reluctant sounds. The vehicle didn't fight so much as it sighed, as though the forest had held it too long and was now forced to release it. When the rear wheels finally rolled free, Mason saw more clearly what they had been dealing with. The faded insignia of a county department barely visible under grime. 12 years could erase a lot, but not everything. They transported the vehicle to the Ranger's temporary impound lot, a fenced gravel clearing near the station, fitted with 2 security cameras mounted on steel poles. It wasn't sophisticated, but it was monitored. Silas locked the gate behind them as dusk bled purple across the sky. Lila turned to Mason. "You understand this is now active jurisdiction," she said evenly. "You're here as a technical consultant, not as a freelancer." Her voice wasn't accusatory. It was boundary setting. Mason nodded once. Understood. She held his gaze for a second longer, as if measuring something invisible in him, his restraint maybe. Then she moved to her cruiser to log initial reports. Inside the impound area, Mason and Silas began a controlled preliminary check of the vehicle's condition. They didn't open compartments yet. They documented. The smell inside the cabin when the doors were finally unsealed was stale and layered. Old vinyl, damp fabric, rust. But beneath that, Coda's ears twitched. He stepped forward without being told and stopped just inside the threshold. His nose lifted, nostrils flaring in short, sharp pulls. His posture shifted. Not aggression, not anxiety. Recognition. Mason crouched beside him. "What is it?" he murmured softly. Coda didn't respond in human language. He never did. But his tail stiffened slightly, not wagging, not tucked. His breathing deepened. There was something in the air that didn't belong to decay. Silas noticed the change. "You seeing something?" "Smelling," Mason replied. They began inspecting the interior more closely. In the back seat area, under a brittle tarp, Lila found the plastic-wrapped journal. She carefully lifted it with gloved hands and handed it over to Mason to examine under supervision. The plastic was fogged with age, but intact. Mason unwrapped it slowly on a flat evidence table. The journal inside was standard issue. Black cover, spiral bound. Its pages were yellowed but dry. The first few entries were procedural. Names, dates, patrol routes. Then the handwriting shifted, became hurried. And then the line appeared. "Don't trust the man with the badge." It wasn't dramatic ink. It wasn't scrawled wildly. It was written carefully, deliberately. Mason felt the air leave his lungs. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Lila leaned over his shoulder, reading. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Silas watched them both with quiet suspicion, sensing that something in the words had struck deeper than simple corruption. Mason flipped further. Repeated references to secondary route near the lake, mentions of K9 interference, notes about handler knowledge. The words handler knowledge made Mason's chest tighten. He thought of that day overseas, the way the enemy had known exactly how to position noise, scent, distraction. The way someone had understood how to turn a dog's instincts against its team. He closed the journal gently. "Whoever wrote this," he said carefully, "knew dogs, not casually, professionally." Silas frowned. "Meaning?" "Meaning if someone's been back to this vehicle recently." Mason let the sentence trail. He didn't need to finish it. Lila's radio crackled softly at her belt. Routine chatter, background noise. The impound lot lights flickered on automatically as night settled. Everything seemed still. Too still. Coda suddenly moved. Not toward the vehicle, not toward the gate. He walked to the edge of the lot and stopped near the fence where gravel met pine needles. Then he lowered his head. He did not bark. He did not growl. He inhaled once, deeply, and then, slowly, almost reverently, he lay down. Mason's stomach dropped. This was not a search posture. It was not alert posture. It was the posture Coda used only once before, years ago, after an explosion overseas, when he had lain beside a fallen teammate until medics arrived. A silent vigil. Mason crossed the gravel quickly. "Coda," he said, voice rougher now. The dog's eyes lifted to Wind, steady and unafraid. Not panicked. Certain. Silas approached from the side. "What's he doing?" Mason scanned the ground where Coda lay. There, half pressed into the gravel just beyond the fence line, was a faint impression, not fresh mud, not obvious, but distinct. A boot print, large, deep heel, aggressive tread pattern, recent. Lila stepped over with her flashlight and angled the beam low. The light caught edges in the dirt that daylight had softened. She didn't curse. She didn't gasp. She simply said, very quietly, "He was watching." Mason's pulse slowed, not sped up. He'd felt that before. The shift from confusion to clarity. Someone hadn't just revisited the vehicle. Someone had stood here. Close enough to see. Close enough to know. Coda remained lying down, guarding that invisible line as if protecting more than gravel. Protecting truth itself. Silas secured the perimeter tighter after that. Darren had long since left with a nod and a promise to stay quiet. Lila requested a patrol car sweep the outer access road, though they all knew the woods had more exits than maps admitted. Later that night, Mason was permitted to stay in a small administrative room inside the range station. It had a metal desk, 2 chairs, and a narrow window overlooking the lot. He sat there with the journal open again, Coda at his feet. The overhead light hummed faintly. Mason traced a finger along the line in the notebook. Don't trust the man with the badge. He remembered the desert heat, the radio static, the confidence in the voice that had assured them the route was clean. He remembered the explosion and the silence after. Coda shifted slightly, pressing against Mason's boot. "You smell him, don't you?" Mason whispered. Coda didn't look up, but his ears angled toward the window, as if something beyond it still lingered. Around midnight, the external cameras logged minor motion detection, nothing dramatic, just a shadow crossing briefly near the tree line beyond the fence. The system time-stamped it. When Mason and Lila reviewed the footage together, they saw only a silhouette, tall, hooded, moving with purpose. Not a teenager, not a drunk wanderer. Controlled steps, professional distance. The figure paused once, just once, near the exact section of fence where Coda had lain earlier, then disappeared into the trees. Lila's jaw clenched. That's not coincidence. Mason shook his head slowly. No. Silas entered quietly, having finished his rounds. Tracks? Light, Lila replied, but deliberate. Silas nodded once. Then this isn't an old ghost. Mason closed the journal. He looked at Coda. The dog met his gaze, eyes dark and steady. There was no fear in them, only readiness. And Mason understood something then. Not about the case, Not about the badge. Not about the vehicle. He understood that whatever had tried to erase names and bury evidence hadn't counted on one thing: a dog who remembered, and a man who no longer ran from what memory meant. The impound lot lights hummed softly outside. The forest beyond the fence was black now, but not empty. Mason leaned back in the metal chair and let the quiet settle around him, not as peace, but as preparation. Somewhere out there, someone knew how to silence a dog. But Coda had chosen not to bark, and that choice meant something. The night held its breath, and so did they. Morning arrived pale and sharp, like a blade drawn across frost. The ranger station sat quiet beneath a sky washed clean of clouds. Pine needles glittered in early light. From a distance, everything looked harmless. Orderly gravel, chain-link fence, the impounded G-Wagon resting inside like a captured animal. Up close, the air felt different. Mason stood beside the vehicle with his field jacket zipped halfway, boots planted shoulder-width apart. His blue-gray eyes studied the dashboard through the open driver's door. Coda stood close to his left knee, posture balanced, ears half forward, not tense, but alert enough to read every shift in Mason's breathing. Deputy Lila Hart joined him with a clipboard tucked under her arm. Her ponytail was tighter this morning, practical. The faint scar above her brow caught the light as she squinted toward the vehicle's interior. "You said you can power it safely?" she asked. Mason nodded once, temporarily, just enough to see if any electronics respond. No ignition, no movement. Silas leaned against the fence a few yards away, arms crossed. The ranger's pale eyes scanned the tree line while pretending not to watch Mason too closely. Mason unzipped his half-track pack and removed a compact jump starter. Military grade, scratched but reliable. He handled it the way some men handled heirlooms, respectfully. He popped the hood carefully. Rust creaked but didn't resist. The engine bay was layered in dust and old leaves. Mason brushed debris aside with gloved hands, checking connections. His movements were precise, economical, nothing wasted. "Battery's dead," he murmured, "but wiring looks intact enough for a brief feed." Lila stepped closer, watching. She wasn't intimidated by mechanics, but she respected competence when she saw it. Mason connected the clamps. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the dashboard flickered weakly, like an old memory trying to return. The radio panel lit up, silence filled the cabin. Coda shifted, nose lifting slightly. Mason reached forward slowly and pressed the power button. A burst of static cracked through the air. Everyone flinched. The sound wasn't loud, but it was intimate, like someone whispering directly into the ear. Static faded into a faint mechanical whirring. Something inside the radio clicked and struggled. Then, a distorted inhale. Breathing. Ragged. Wet. Mason's jaw tightened. The voice that followed was broken by interference, as if dragged through water and time. "Don't trust." Static swallowed the next word. "Badge." Crackle. "He knows how." Distortion. "Make a K9. The recording cut abruptly. The radio died with a dull pop. No dramatic crescendo, just silence. The kind that presses against the ribs. Lila stared at the dashboard. For a split second, the professional mask slipped. Her father had worn a badge in this county 20 years ago. A respected officer. A quiet man who came home smelling like pine and paperwork. He had died of a heart condition 3 years back. Before she ever thought to ask him about cold cases, her eyes didn't water. But something in them shifted. "That's archived evidence," she said carefully. "That recording should have been logged if it was official." Mason unplugged the jump starter slowly. "Unless it never made it to evidence," he replied. Silas pushed off the fence, stepping closer now. "Or someone didn't want it to." Coda's breathing deepened. He moved into the driver's footwell without being told and lowered his head, nose hovering near the pedals. He wasn't frantic. He was calculating. Mason watched him, heart steady but heavy. "You picking up something new?" he murmured. Coda inhaled once, sharply, then turned his head toward the passenger side floorboard. Mason leaned over carefully. There, wedged between old carpet and rusted trim, was a small fragment of nylon cord. Thin, braided, clean compared to the rest of the decay. Silas exhaled quietly. That wasn't here 12 years ago. Lila photographed it before carefully removing it with tweezers. "Same material as what we found outside?" she asked. "Looks similar," Silas replied. Mason didn't look at them. He was staring at the radio. That voice. It wasn't just a warning. It was afraid. And that fear felt familiar. They reviewed the rest of the cabin methodically. No dramatics. No hidden weapons springing out. Just small signs that the vehicle had been accessed. Subtle shifts in debris, slight inconsistencies in dust layers. A loosened panel near the rear. Silas excused himself mid-morning to check a report of ATV tracks near the lake perimeter. His boots crunched across gravel as he left, posture straight but shoulders tight. That left Mason and Lila near the vehicle. For a moment, neither spoke. Finally, Lila broke the silence. "My father worked a case out here," she said quietly. "About a missing handler. K9 unit. I was 12. I remember him coming home late. Not angry, just frustrated." She folded her arms. "He said once that sometimes the uniform doesn't mean what it should." Mason met her eyes, stormwater blue against sharp hazel. "That recording," he said, "it wasn't paranoia. It was someone who'd figured something out too late." Lila nodded once, slowly. "And if someone knows how to neutralize a working dog," she added. "They've trained with one." Coda suddenly lifted his head sharply. His body stiffened. Not at the vehicle, not at the lot, at the tree line beyond the fence. Mason turned instantly. Nothing visible, no movement. But Coda's ears angled forward with laser focus. Coda took 3 steps toward the fence and stopped. He did not bark. He did not growl. Instead, he made a sound Mason had only heard once before, a low, controlled exhale through his nose, almost like a restrained sigh. It wasn't fear. It wasn't aggression. It was recognition. Mason's stomach tightened. "Coda," he said softly. The dog's gaze never wavered from the trees. Then, almost imperceptibly, his tail lowered a fraction. Not submission, respect. Like acknowledging another trained presence somewhere unseen, Lila felt it too. She didn't know why, but the air seemed charged. "Someone's close," she whispered. Mason didn't answer, because in that moment, he understood something cold and precise. Whoever was out there wasn't reckless. They were disciplined, and they knew dogs. The tension dissolved slowly when nothing emerged from the woods. Wind moved branches. A bird startled from a higher limb. But Mason knew the difference between imagined danger and the kind that stood just beyond sight. By late afternoon, Silas returned with confirmation. Fresh ATV marks near the secondary lake trail. Not from casual recreation. The pattern was controlled. Consistent spacing, slow turns. "Whoever's moving, through there," Silas said, "isn't joyriding." Lila logged the report, face set in professional calm. "Then we treat this as an ongoing investigation," she said firmly, "and we assume we're being observed." Mason closed the G-Wagon's door gently. The metallic click echoed differently now. Less abandoned. More claimed. As evening approached, impound lot lights flickered on automatically. And for 40 seconds, They flickered off again. Not a full blackout. Just enough to disrupt. The cameras, when checked later, showed a brief signal distortion. Static blur. No image. Exactly 40 seconds. When the feed returned, the lot looked normal. Except Coda stood near the front tire, breathing harder than before. At his paws lay a thin length of braided wire, almost invisible against gravel. A restraint line, cut cleanly at one end. Lila's expression hardened. That's not random. Silas crouched to examine it. Placed, not dropped. Mason's jaw flexed. The message was clear. Not loud, not threatening, but deliberate. Someone had come close enough to test, close enough to leave something, and close enough to understand that Coda was the variable. Mason knelt and placed a steady hand against Coda's shoulder. "You're not going quiet," he murmured. Coda didn't look afraid. He looked focused. The night deepened beyond the fence. And somewhere in the dark, a man who knew how to silence a dog had just tried to measure how difficult that would be. Mason stood slowly, eyes fixed on the forest. He had trusted a badge once. He would not make that mistake again. But this time, he wasn't walking alone into the unknown. He had a dog who remembered, and a truth that refused to stay buried. The gravel lot hummed softly under artificial light. The woods beyond remained patient, watching, waiting. The map wasn't dramatic. It wasn't stained in blood or folded like treasure from a pirate tale. It was a standard topographic printout, creased, annotated in pen, edges softened by time. The X had been drawn near the southern edge of Lake Mercer, where the shoreline bent into a marshy inlet thick with reeds and low fog in the mornings. Mason studied it at the ranger station table while Coda lay at his boots, chin resting on crossed paws, eyes half closed but never truly asleep. Silas traced the route with a calloused finger. "This trail hasn't been maintained in years," he said. "ATVs use it sometimes, hunters too, but it's not marked on tourist maps anymore." Lila folded her arms. Her expression had become quieter in recent days, not softer, but more inward. The discovery of the journal had unsettled her. The radio recording had anchored that unease in something real. Now the X felt personal. "When did this case go cold?" she asked. Silas didn't hesitate. 12 years ago. Same timeline as the vehicle. Mason folded the map carefully and slipped it into a waterproof sleeve. "Then, we go now," he said simply. The trail to the lake was narrower than expected. Branches leaned low, brushing Mason's shoulders as he walked. His olive field jacket collected pine scent and bits of bark like it belonged to the forest as much as he did. The air thickened with moisture the closer they moved toward the water. Coda walked ahead this time. No leash, but never straying far. His gait was purposeful, nose mapping invisible lines. Silas followed several paces behind, scanning for signs of disturbance. Lila brought up the rear, one hand resting near her sidearm out of habit rather than fear. The marshland opened slowly, reeds swayed in slow rhythm. The lake reflected the sky like polished steel. Dragonflies hovered in delicate patrols above stagnant pools. Beautiful, deceptively peaceful. Coda slowed near a cluster of low brush just beyond the waterline. Mason didn't call out. He trusted the dog's shifts now the way he once trusted radio signals. Coda circled once, nose tight to the ground. Then he stopped at a patch of earth that looked undisturbed to anyone without training. He glanced back at Mason. Not dramatic, not urgent, just steady. Mason crouched. The soil here was softer, marsh-fed, recently disturbed though rain had tried to smooth it over. He brushed aside leaves gently. There it was, a corner of metal, Silas exhaled through his teeth. You've got to be kidding. They dug carefully, hands gloved. Within minutes, they uncovered a small steel lockbox, surface rusted, but intact. The latch was simple. No elaborate security. Whoever had buried it assumed time would do the protecting. Lila photographed it before opening. Inside were several sealed evidence envelopes, yellowed but preserved. A folded photograph, a tarnished auxiliary badge, smaller than standard issue, the kind given to K-9 units for ceremonial identification. Lila froze. Her hand hovered over the badge without touching it. It bore her father's initials. Not the main badge, the K-9 unit badge. Mason watched her carefully. Lila was not a woman prone to outward collapse. She was disciplined, structured, built from years of managing chaos in measured increments. But something in her eyes fractured quietly. I didn't know he ever had one of these, she said softly. Silas stepped back, giving her space. Mason studied the rest of the contents. The envelopes were labeled with case numbers, some crossed out. One had a note scribbled across the front. Handler compromised. He felt the air shift again. This wasn't about smuggling or simple corruption. This was about erasure. Lila finally lifted the badge. Her fingers trembled once, then steadied. He never talked about the handler, she said. He just said the dog disappeared. Mason's jaw tightened. Dogs don't disappear, he said. They're reassigned, retired, or buried. Coda stepped closer to the open box. He lowered his nose near the badge. He did not lick it. He did not whine. He inhaled once, deeply. Then his body stiffened. His ears angled sharply toward the waterline. Coda moved suddenly, not fast, but decisively, toward the reeds. He pushed his snout into the tall grass and stopped. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then Mason saw it. A faint glint beneath the mud where water met land. He stepped closer, heart steady but alert. Embedded in the shallow muck was a small metal tag, the kind attached to K-9 collars, scratched, worn. The engraved name had been gouged out with deliberate force. But beneath the damage, faint letters remained, just enough to see the beginning. A R. Mason didn't finish reading, because the realization hit before the rest of the letters mattered. Someone hadn't just buried evidence. Someone had erased a dog. Coda backed up slowly from the reeds, posture tight. Not afraid, acknowledging. Mason felt a surge of cold clarity. Whoever was behind this didn't just know how to silence a dog. They knew how to erase one. They collected everything carefully. Lila's composure returned, not because she wasn't shaken, but because she chose to channel it. This goes to the lab, she said firmly. Chain of custody, documented, every piece. Silas nodded. As they packed up, Mason's thoughts shifted. If the handler had been compromised and the dog erased, then the G-Wagon wasn't an accident. It was containment, a mobile vault. And someone had revisited it recently because something inside still mattered. The walk back to the vehicles was quieter. Not tense, just heavy. When they reached the Ranger lot, Mason stopped mid-step. His eyes went to his truck. The left rear tire sagged slightly. Not flat, just enough. He approached carefully. A clean slice ran along the sidewall, precise, controlled. Not vandalism, message. Lila noticed next. Silas muttered under his breath. Mason didn't react outwardly. He scanned the windshield. That's when he saw it. Across the glass, drawn in smeared mud, was a symbol. Not random, not childish, an X. But not the simple mark from the map. This one had an additional line intersecting at the center, almost like a crosshair. Lila stared at it. That's not from today's dig, she said quietly. Mason nodded. No. Coda stepped forward and sniffed the tire, then the door handle, then the ground. He lifted his head and looked into the trees beyond the lot, not searching wildly, but tracking direction. Silas tightened his jaw. He was here. Mason's pulse stayed level. Fear wasn't what filled him. Recognition was. The person behind this wasn't panicking. They were escalating, testing proximity. He crouched beside Coda and placed a steady hand along the dog's shoulder. You wanted us to find it, he murmured under his breath. Not to Coda, but to the unseen presence who had carved names out of metal. Lila straightened, resolve hardening her features. This is no longer a cold case, she said. It's active. Silas glanced at Mason. You still in? Mason looked at the scratched tag now sealed in evidence, at the slashed tire, at the mark on the glass. His blue-gray eyes were calm, but deeper now. I don't walk away from erased names, he said. Coda leaned lightly against his leg, not needing command, just choosing position. The lake shimmered quietly in the distance. The forest held its secrets close. And somewhere beyond sight, a man who believed he could erase a K9's identity had just learned something important. Some dogs leave more than tracks, and some men don't stop digging. The wire had been almost invisible. That was the part Mason kept replaying. Not thick rope, not crude trapline. A thin, braided restraint cord positioned at knee height along the edge of the tree line, angled in such a way that any protective dog would instinctively surge forward, placing its own body between handler and perceived threat. Placed not for a deer, not for a coyote, for a K9. The morning after they found Mason's slashed tire, they returned to the secondary trail near the marsh. Silas had flagged the area for additional sweep. Lila insisted they proceed slow and documented. Mason walked with Coda slightly ahead, but within reach. His olive jacket brushed low branches. His boots moved quieter than they had any right to for a man his size. Coda's posture was alert, but balanced. He did not expect the trap. He recognized the scent. That was worse. It happened in a fraction of a second. A snap of tension, a metallic hiss. Coda lunged, not recklessly, but protectively, when a distant shape shifted between trees. Mason didn't even see the shape clearly. He saw only the dog's body move. Then the wire caught. Not his neck, his front leg. The restraint tightened with cruel precision, designed to cinch without killing, immobilize, not slaughter. Coda yelped. Once, sharp, controlled. Mason's world detonated. He dropped to his knees instantly, hands already working. Easy, easy, buddy, easy. The wire had cut into fur and skin, not deep, but enough to draw bright red against black and tan. Coda didn't thrash. He trembled but held eye contact with Mason, trusting. That trust felt like a blade in Mason's chest. Because once, years ago, he had seen another dog trust like that, and it had ended differently. Cut it, Lila ordered, voice firm but steady. Mason's knife flashed open. He sliced the line cleanly, hands controlled despite the tremor in his pulse. Silas scanned the woods with raised rifle, eyes sharp. He set it for the dog, he said quietly. Not random. Mason pressed his hand against Coda's shoulder, grounding both of them. Blood seeped through his fingers. I know, he said, and the knowledge burned. They transported Coda immediately, not to an emergency hospital an hour away, but to someone local who understood working dogs. Dr. Naomi Klein. Her clinic sat on the edge of town, a modest white building with blue shutters, and a wooden sign that read, Klein Veterinary Services in hand-painted lettering. Naomi met them at the door before they even knocked. She was in her late 30s, tall and slender, with ash blonde hair pulled into a low knot at the nape of her neck. Her skin carried the pale warmth of someone who preferred indoors to sun. But her arms were strong and steady from years of lifting anxious animals onto steel tables. A faint crescent-shaped scar marked her right wrist, a dog bite from her internship days. She never hid it. Her eyes were gray and observant. Not soft exactly, but deeply attentive. She spoke gently without being fragile. "Bring him in," she said, already moving. Inside, the clinic smelled of antiseptic and faint lavender. A sleepy orange tabby cat lounged on a high shelf, blinking lazily at the commotion. The cat, clearly senior and unimpressed by drama, flicked its tail but did not move. Naomi knelt beside Coda on the exam mat. She didn't rush. She let him see her hands first. "Hey there, soldier," she murmured softly. Coda sniffed once, then allowed her touch. Naomi examined the wound carefully. "Superficial laceration," she said. "Painful, but clean. Whoever set this didn't want to maim." Mason's jaw tightened. "Immobilize," he muttered. Naomi glanced at him briefly. "You've seen this before." He didn't answer. She irrigated the cut, applied antiseptic, wrapped the leg with efficient, practiced precision. Her movements were calm, almost reverent. Silas leaned against the wall, arms crossed. Lila stood near the window, watching traffic pass outside, as if expecting someone to slow down and stare. Naomi held up the severed wire Mason had brought in a sealed bag. She sniffed it lightly, then frowned. "That's not generic hardware store cord," she said. Mason's eyes flicked up. "It's braided restraint line," Naomi continued. "Used in advanced K9 handling, temporary control lines for aggressive or high-drive dogs." Lila's shoulders stiffened. "You're sure?" Naomi nodded. "I trained under a federal K9 program years ago. We use this exact weave. It's durable, lightweight, hard to see." Mason felt something cold settle into place. This wasn't improvisation. This was familiarity. Naomi finished bandaging Coda's leg and leaned closer to his face. She didn't speak for a moment. She just watched him. Coda watched back. Then, unexpectedly, he leaned forward and pressed his nose lightly against her wrist. The one with the crescent scar, Naomi, froze, her breath caught almost invisibly. "That's odd," she murmured. "What?" Mason asked. She hesitated. "He's not reacting like he encountered a stranger's scent." Silence filled the room. Naomi's gray eyes sharpened. "He's reacting like he recognized the handler profile. Not the person, but the pattern, the posture, the energy." Mason felt his pulse deepen. "You mean?" Naomi shook her head slightly. "I mean, whoever set that line has worked with K9s professionally. And not long ago." She met Mason's gaze directly now. "And your dog didn't panic. He anticipated." The weight of that realization pressed heavier than the wound itself. After treatment, Coda stood on 3 steady legs, bandage bright white against dark fur. He leaned lightly into Mason's thigh, seeking reassurance. Not because he doubted Mason, but because pain demanded contact. Mason crouched and rested his forehead briefly against Coda's temple. "I'm sorry," he whispered. He hadn't meant to say it aloud, but it came anyway. The room stayed quiet. Lila stepped forward then, her voice firmer than it had been all morning. "You don't go rogue," she said. Mason looked up slowly. "You don't storm into the woods alone," she continued. "You don't chase shadows because you're angry." His jaw flexed. "I won't lose another dog because I hesitated." Lila's hazel eyes didn't waver. "And you won't save this one by abandoning the law." The words landed, not as accusation, as anchor. Silas nodded faintly from his place against the wall. "He wants you emotional. That's the trap." Mason stood slowly. He hated being managed, but he hated repeating mistakes more. Naomi handed him discharge instructions. Keep weight off it for 48 hours, no long treks. Mason almost laughed at that, but he nodded. As they moved toward the door, Naomi added quietly, "Your dog reacted like he'd encountered someone who once held a leash." Mason stopped. Not dramatically, just enough. Naomi continued, voice low but steady. "Not today, not physically, but the scent memory triggered that posture." The room seemed smaller. "You're saying," Lila began. "I'm saying the person who set that restraint understands how to stand around a working dog without raising alarm." Mason felt it fully then, the shape of it. This wasn't random cruelty. It wasn't territorial vandalism. It was someone trained, someone disciplined, someone patient, and possibly someone who had been near Coda before Mason ever adopted him. They stepped outside into late afternoon light. The town looked peaceful. A child rode a bicycle down the sidewalk. A pickup truck rolled past with lumber stacked in the back. Normal life. Mason rested his hand against Coda's neck. The dog's breathing had steadied. Pain dulled by trust. Lila approached Mason quietly. "We do this smart," she said. He nodded. For the first time since the trap snapped, he wasn't thinking about vengeance. He was thinking about strategy, about patience, about earning back the trust he felt he had nearly betrayed. Coda leaned gently into his leg again. Alive, present, unbroken. The forest beyond town remained silent. But Mason knew now. The cost of trust wasn't fear, it was responsibility. And this time, he would carry it properly. The morning the truth surfaced, the sky was painfully clear. It felt almost indecent that the sun would rise so generously over a town that had carried a buried lie for 12 years. Mason stood beside the G-Wagon in the Ranger impound lot, its moss long washed away, its body cleaned but not restored. The vehicle looked older now, not forgotten, just tired. Like a witness who had finally agreed to speak, Coda stood at his side. His front leg wrapped in clean white bandage, posture steady despite the healing wound. His black and tan coat caught the light. His dark eyes were alert, not anxious. Pain had not broken him. Neither had memory. Deputy Lila Hart approached from the station building with a file folder tucked under her arm. Her uniform was crisp, but her eyes told a different story. One of long nights, reopened reports, and a daughter reading her father's silence in margins of forgotten paperwork. She had found it. Not a smoking gun. Something quieter. A transfer request, filed by her father 2 weeks before the handler disappeared. Denied. A supplemental note written in careful script. Internal concern. K-9 response compromised during joint operation. Request review of supervising officer. The supervising officer's name had been redacted in archived copies, but not in the buried documents. Lila held the page now, with the name intact. Captain Rowan Hale. Silas stood nearby, jaw set. He had known Hale. Everyone in the department had. Hale had retired early, citing stress-related health concerns, moved south, and never returned. Tall, broad, clean-cut even off duty, a man whose handshake had been firm and whose eyes rarely blinked first. Respected. Untouchable. Mason studied the name without visible reaction. Handler compromised, he said quietly. Badge involved? Lila nodded once. My father requested an internal review, she said. It never happened. Silas exhaled slowly. Hale supervised the K-9 unit at the time. The air seemed to settle differently around them. Mason didn't look surprised. He looked resolved. We reopen officially, Lila said. Through state channels, if we have to. Her voice trembled only once, and she caught it. I used to think my father stepped back because he was afraid, she continued. Now I think he stepped back because he was protecting someone. Mason studied her carefully. Or protecting you. The words landed. She didn't argue. They performed one final, thorough search of the G-Wagon before submitting it to state investigators. Mason moved methodically through the cabin, not as a soldier, not as a vigilante, but as a man honoring evidence. Under the rear seat panel, loosened but not removed, he found something that hadn't been logged in the initial sweep. A small, laminated photograph, edges curled with age. He held it gently between his fingers. It showed a younger version of Rowan Hale standing beside a German shepherd. Strong posture, hand resting confidently on the dog's harness. Beside him stood another officer, Lila's father, unmistakably younger, but bearing the same steady gaze she carried now. The dog in the photo had alert ears and intelligent eyes. On the harness, barely visible, the name patch read, Archer. Mason felt something in his chest tighten. He crouched slowly and lowered the photograph toward Coda. The dog leaned forward, sniffed, then let out a low, almost inaudible whine. Not distress, recognition, not of the specific dog, but of the role, the erased one. Lila saw it. Her hand rose to her mouth, and for the first time since this investigation began, her composure cracked openly. He tried to bring it forward, she whispered, and someone buried it. Silas placed a steady hand on her shoulder. Not comfort exactly, but solidarity. Mason stood. He didn't fail, he said quietly. He documented. He hid what he couldn't fight. Lila wiped her eyes quickly, then nodded. I won't hide it. As they prepared to close the vehicle doors one last time, sunlight broke across the windshield at just the right angle. It reflected off the interior rearview mirror and cast a narrow beam directly across the hood. Mason followed the line of light instinctively and saw something faint beneath the cleaned paint. A shallow engraving. Not factory, not decorative, hand-done. 3 letters. A-R-C. He froze. Silas leaned closer. Archer, he murmured. The name had been scratched into the metal by someone who needed it remembered, even if official records erased it. Mason ran his thumb gently over the faint groove. Not deep, but permanent. Coda stepped forward and placed his paw lightly against the hood, directly beneath the letters. No command given, no training cue, just instinct. The light shifted slightly as clouds moved overhead, but for that brief moment, the name glowed. Not dramatic, just enough. Lila swallowed hard. He knew, she whispered. My father knew they were trying to erase him. Mason nodded slowly, and he made sure they couldn't. The official process moved swiftly after that. Lila contacted State Internal Affairs. Silas provided terrain reports. Naomi submitted documentation on the restraint line. The braided wire was matched to procurement records from the old K9 unit, signed off under Hale's supervision. Nothing flashy, just paper trail, just patience. Mason did not storm the woods. He did not hunt. He stayed present. Coda remained at his side, leg healing steadily. When the state investigator arrived 2 days later, a tall woman with steel-gray hair cut blunt at her jaw and eyes like polished slate. She introduced herself simply as Investigator Marla Dorsey. Her handshake was dry, firm, controlled. She listened more than she spoke. She reviewed the documentation quietly. Then she said, "If this holds, it wasn't just negligence." Lila met her gaze. "No." "It was redirection," Mason added. Dorsey nodded once. "Then we do this by the book." For the first time in 12 years, the book was open. The G-Wagon was eventually transported, not to a scrapyard, but to a secured state facility. Before it left, Mason stood beside it one last time. He placed his palm on the hood where Archer's name lay faint beneath metal. "You're not forgotten," he said softly. Coda stood tall beside him. Not limping now, just steady. The impound lot felt different, lighter, not because the mystery was gone, but because the silence had been broken. Lila approached him as the transport truck secured the vehicle. "You didn't chase him," she said. Mason glanced at her. "No, you trusted." He considered that. "I learned." She nodded. "My father tried to do the right thing alone," she said. "He paid for it." Mason looked toward the tree line beyond town. The forest still stood patient, still held shadows, but it no longer felt like it owned him. "Coda, already paid once," he said. "Not again." Coda shifted slightly, ears flicking toward distant woods. A faint growl rumbled low in his chest. Not fear, awareness. The scent of the past lingered somewhere out there, faint but not gone. Mason rested his hand along Coda's neck. "This time," he murmured, eyes steady on the horizon, "we don't run from it." The sun climbed higher. Light rested on the hood one last time before the truck pulled away. The name Archer faded back into subtlety, but not into absence. Lila stood beside Mason in silence as dust settled. Her father's silence had ended. Mason's guilt had shifted, and a dog once erased had been remembered. The forest beyond the town line remained watchful. But for the first time since that buried vehicle surfaced, Mason did not feel hunted. He felt anchored. Beside him, Coda lifted his head toward the trees and released a low, steady sound. Not warning. Not challenge. Acknowledgement. The woods did not answer, but they listened. And that was enough. Sometimes, what we call a miracle does not arrive as thunder or fire from the heavens. Sometimes it comes quietly, through a loyal dog who refuses to forget, through a buried truth that rises back into the light, or through a wounded heart that finally learns to trust again. In this story, the forest listened. The past spoke. And what was erased was remembered. Maybe that is how God works more often than we realize. Not by removing pain, but by walking with us through it. Not by silencing the darkness, but by placing a light exactly where we are afraid to look. In our daily lives, we all carry something unfinished. A loss we never explained, a mistake we wish we could undo, a truth we buried because it felt safer that way. But faith reminds us of this. What is hidden is never beyond God's reach. What is broken is never beyond His healing. And what is forgotten by the world is never forgotten by Him. If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you of loyalty, of justice, of grace, or of the quiet miracles that still happen every day, please share it with someone who might need that reminder. Leave a comment and tell us what part of the story spoke to your heart. And if you believe in stories that honor courage, faith, and the bond between humans and animals, subscribe to K9 Navy SEAL Stories so we can continue this journey together. May God bless you, protect you, and guide your steps. May He heal what you carry in silence. And may He remind you, today and always, that you are never walking alone.